The ISV Dominion was not built to be quiet. It was built to be seen. 3 km of reinforced carbon titanium hull. 8 rotating weapons platforms each. 1 capable of cracking a small moon. 4 ion pulse engines that burned blue-white and left a thermal trail across the dark like a scar that would not heal for weeks. It moved through the outer edge of the Kepler drift the way an old mountain moves through a valley. Not fast, not graceful, but with the kind of weight that made the ground remember it long after it had passed. Inside the Dominion, Captain Aliena Vasquez was eating instant noodles at her command chair. She slurped loudly. Lieutenant Commander Dex Harlow, standing at the navigation console 3M away, stared at his display and said nothing. He had learned in the 14 months of deep space transit that the captain's eating habits were not up for discussion. Neither was her coffee, black 3 cups before 600, consumed in silence. That felt like a law of nature. Drift coordinates confirmed, said they. Nav AI in its flat, polite voice, we are now beyond mapped human space. Vasquez set her noodles down. That was it, no ceremony, no speech. She looked at the front viewport, stars she had no names for, arranged in patterns no human eye had ever traced into shapes, and she looked for a long moment, and then she picked up her noodles again. Log it, she said. Harlow logged it. The crew of the Dominion was 412 people. Some of them were soldiers, some were scientists, a few were both in the blurry way that deep space service tended to produce, people who had learned to read sensor data with one hand and run weapons diagnostics with the other. They had been in space for over a year. They had already fixed 3 engine coolant failures, survived 1 gravity plating collapse in the lower decks that left Deck 7 floating for 6 hours, and eaten every single item in the ship's original food stores twice. Chief Engineer Yara Singh had personally threatened to space the next person who complained about the synthetic protein options. Nobody was entirely sure she was joking. This was the first Titan-class warship humanity had ever launched. The Earth Collective had built it in 11 years. That was remarkable by any standard. In the early drafts of the Dominion project, the engineers had estimated 17 years at minimum, but humanity had a way of compressing timelines when it was afraid of missing something. The discovery of the Kepler drift, a natural corridor of low-resistance space that bent physics politely out of the way and allowed faster than expected travel, had lit a fire under every space agency on Earth. Other civilizations might use it, had used it. The long-range probes had come back with data that was difficult to argue with, distorted energy readings, ancient geometric drift patterns, the faint but undeniable residue of structured propulsion exhaust. Something was out there. So humanity built something back. The Dominion was the answer to a question nobody had officially asked. Yet it was not technically a warship in the traditional sense. The official designation was multi-purpose exploration and security vessel. But if you stood at the end of it and looked at the weapons platforms and the reinforced hull plating and the 4 torpedo bays and the 2 electromagnetic pulse arrays and the point defense grid that could track and destroy 600 incoming targets per second, the word exploration felt a little optimistic. Vasquez had commanded 3 vessels. Before this one, a patrol frigate on the Mars Corridor, a deep survey ship that spent 2 years cataloging gas giants in the outer system, a mid-class destroyer. During the brief and ugly conflict over the Europa mining rights that nobody in the history books would call a war, even though people had died. She was 43 years old. She had a daughter back on Earth who sent voice messages every 2 weeks, and Vasquez listened to every one of them. Twice alone with the cabin door sealed. She did not discuss her daughter with the crew. She did not discuss much of anything personal. What she was on the bridge of the Dominion was precise, steady, the kind of calm that was not the absence of feeling, but the mastery of it, the way a surgeon is calm or a bomb technician, not because nothing matters, because everything does. Captain, this was Lieutenant Ossiat. The sensor array, young, careful, one of the scientist's stern soldiers. The deep space program seemed to grow. I'm reading something unusual in the drift corridor ahead. Define unusual. Energy signatures, not natural. Patterned. He paused. His hands moved over his console with the tight, restrained energy of someone trying very hard not to get excited. They look like beacon signals, ma'am. Old ones, but active. The bridge went quiet. Not the scared kind of quiet, the focused kind. The difference mattered. Vasquez set down her noodles for the second time. She did not pick them up again. 47 light-years away, in the great orbital station of the Valkyrie Accord, the governing body that had held the peace of 11 star systems for 3,000 years. A sensor technician named Brinso dropped her data pad. It hit the floor. She did not pick it up. She stared at her display with a particular expression of someone whose entire understanding of how the universe works has just been quietly revised. Her 3 upper sensory stalks, the thin, bioluminescent organs that the Valkyrie used for both hearing and emotional display, had gone completely dark. That was not good. When a Valkyrie stalks went dark, it meant the brain had stopped allocating resources to social signaling because it needed everything it had for pure, uncut panic. Supervisor, she said. Her supervisor, Velharith, was on the other side of the room. Supervisor, louder. Velharith crossed to her in 3 long strides. He looked at her display. His own stalks went dark within 2 seconds. The display showed the thermal trail of something enormous moving through the Kepler drift. The trail was fresh. The object at the front of it was, according to the sensor data, approximately 3 km in length, massing at several 100,000 tons, and radiating the energy output of a small power station. It was moving on a heading that, if it maintained course, would bring it into contact with the outer edge of Valkyrie monitored space within approximately 40 of their short cycles. 40 short cycles, less than 2 of what the new species called months. Is this? Velharith started. Yes, said Brinso. The humans. Yes. They had been watching humanity for 22 of their long cycles. The monitoring had been cautious, distant, done with small passive probes placed at the edge of the human home system, calibrated to observe. Without interfering, the Accord had a standing policy on pre-contact civilizations: watch, record, assess, wait for readiness. The assessment process alone could take decades. There were questionnaires, reports, subcommittees. A civilization did not get invited into galactic contact until the Accord was satisfied it was safe to do so. The assessment of humanity had been ongoing for 22 long cycles. It had not reached a conclusion. This was in large part because humanity kept doing things that the assessment committee did not have good categories for. The file on the humans officially designated species catalog entry 7441C, informally called the problem file by everyone on the committee, was 4,000 pages long and growing. It included documentation of their wars, which were numerous and brutal and, also confusingly, often ended with the former enemies trading goods and forming alliances within a few generations. It included their art, which ranged from things of extraordinary beauty to things the assessment committee had looked at for a long time and still could not explain. It included their medicine, their engineering, their food culture, their sports, several of which involved either extreme physical danger or the controlled application of violence and were watched by millions of other humans for recreation. It included their humor, which the translation algorithms handled poorly. It included their history of self-destruction and survival, their capacity to cause catastrophic damage to their own environment, and then, when the damage crossed some internal threshold, they had difficulty articulating to mobilize enormous collective effort to fix it. The overall conclusion of the assessment committee after 22 long cycles of study was, we are not ready to reach a conclusion. And now humanity had built a ship. Not a probe, not a survey vessel, a ship that looked to anyone with functioning pattern recognition exactly like what it was, the largest, most powerful thing their species had ever made, pointed outward at the dark, moving. Grand Arbiter Vreth received the alert. At the highest priority level, he was ancient by his species standards, 240 long cycles, which was old enough to have seen 3 civilizations join the accord and 1 be turned away. His stalks had not gone dark in decades. He had, over his long life, developed what he privately thought of as a very stable nervous system. His stalks went dark. He read the sensor report twice, then he sat for a long moment in his chair, which was carved from the fossilized shell of a sea creature that had gone extinct before humanity had learned to make fire. Then he opened a channel to the full Accord Council. Emergency session, he said, all members immediately. The Accord had 11 member species. Representatives of all 11 appeared on his comm screen within minutes, which was itself unusual. The Accord as a body did not move fast. It was not built for fast. It was built for deliberation, for consensus, for the careful grinding of opinion against opinion until something everyone could accept came out the other side. But when Vreth shared the sensor data, every face on the screen, or the equivalent of a face for the species that did not have them, went through the same rapid sequence of reactions: disbelief, verification, acceptance, fear. They are moving through the drift, said Counselor Pry of the Therak, whose species communicated through color changes in their skin and whose translator rendered their words in a flat monotone that gave no hint of the deep red alarm they were currently broadcasting. They have found the drift. Of course they found the drift, said Counselor Vess of the Shan Ma, who was small and angular and spoke fast. Their probe data from the outer system was already showing drift field distortions 3 long cycles ago. We Knew they would find it. The committee said, Vreth with the particular quiet that, on a Valkyrie elder, meant something very much like contempt. Said we were not ready to reach a conclusion. Silence. And now they are here, said Pry. And now they are here, agreed Vreth. Another silence, longer this time. How large is the vessel? Asked one of the smaller counselors, who had not yet looked directly at the data and was, perhaps, still hoping the answer might be reassuring. Vreth told them. Nobody said anything for a while after that. On the bridge of the Dominion, Lieutenant Asai was running the beacon signal through the decryption array for the fourth time. It wasn't encrypted, that was the thing. It was not a code. It was something simpler, a repeating mathematical pattern, prime numbers structured in a sequence that had only one possible interpretation. This is not natural, this was made, we were here. How old are these signals? Vasquez asked. The beacon infrastructure looks old. Ma'am, centuries at minimum, but the signals are active, something is maintaining them. He looked up from his display, or someone. Vasquez looked at the stars ahead of her ship for a long moment. All senior staff, conference room 1 hour. She paused. Tell the kitchen to make real coffee, not the synthetic stuff, the actual reserves. Harlow raised an eyebrow. The actual reserves were for extraordinary occasions only. They had 2 kg left in the whole ship. Understood, he said. Vasquez stood up from her command chair. She was not a tall woman. She had a quiet, compressed kind of presence, the sort that didn't announce itself, but that you noticed when it left the room. She looked at the viewport one more time. Log update, she said to the nav AI. We have found evidence of non-human technological construction within the Kepler drift corridor, course unchanged. We are proceeding. The nav AI logged it. The Dominion moved forward. 3 km of humanity's best work, burning blue-white through the dark, leaving a thermal scar across the sky that would not fade for weeks. In the Valkyria Accord Station, 47 light-years away, 11 species watched the sensor data update in real time as the biggest ship they had ever seen from the human civilization crossed into the monitored zone. The council chamber was very quiet. Grand Arbiter Vreth looked at the display. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about 22 long cycles of reports and questionnaires and subcommittees, and the 4,000-page file that still had no conclusion. He thought about what he knew of humanity. He thought about their wars that turned into trade agreements, their capacity for destruction, and their stubborn, irrational refusal to stay destroyed. Their art, their sports, their humor. That didn't translate. And their ships. Oh, their ships. Well, he said to the silent chamber, to the 11 species watching on their screens, to nobody in particular. They are here. The conference room of the ISV Dominion was not built for comfort. It was built for function. Long table, bolted to the floor, chairs that didn't recline, lighting that was honest in a little harsh, the kind of room that discouraged long speeches because being in it for too long made your lower back hurt. Vasquez liked it for exactly that reason. 7 senior officers sat around the table. The coffee was real, the actual reserves, ground and brewed 20 minutes ago, and the smell of it had filled the room the way good smells do on long voyages, which is to say it hit people somewhere below rational thought and made the world feel briefly less like deep space and more like somewhere that had windows and weather. Vasquez let them drink for a moment before she spoke. Ase summary. Lieutenant Ase stood. He was 29 years old and had the habit, when presenting data, of standing very still and speaking very precisely, as if the information itself was fragile and might break if handled wrong. The beacons are arranged in a corridor pattern along the drift. 11 distinct signal sources, all using the same base mathematical language, a prime sequences, geometric ratios, nothing that could be natural. They have been active for at minimum 3 centuries, based on material decay rates, but they are being maintained. Power is being supplied to them from somewhere we haven't located yet. He paused. They are not pointed at us. They are pointed inward toward the Accord systems. Waypoints, said Chief Engineer Singh. Without looking up from her coffee, she had the kind of voice that was always half a step quieter than it needed to be, which meant you leaned toward her slightly, which meant you paid attention. Their navigation markers, whoever built them, wasn't signaling outward. They were helping their own ships find the way home, which means we are standing in someone's hallway, said Harlow. Yes, said Vasquez. Nobody at the table spoke for a moment. The coffee cooled slightly. Do we stop? Harlow asked. He was not suggesting they stop. He was doing his job, which was to put the question on the table so it had been asked officially, so that everyone in the room had to look at it and decide. Vasquez looked at it. No, she said, we came to make contact. The hallway has an owner. That's not a problem. That's the point. She set down her cup. What we do is signal back. Same mathematical language, prime sequences. We let them know we found their beacons. And we're not here to break anything. She looked at Asai. Can you build a response signal that works within their existing frequency range? Already started, he said, and sat down. That was the meeting. The response signal reached the edge of Valkyrie monitored space 6 hours later. Brenso, the sensor technician who had first detected the Dominion, was still on shift. She had not gone home. She had eaten a nutrient packet at her station and refused to let anyone relieve her, because she was the one who had found them, and she was going to see this through, even if it killed her, which she privately thought it might. When the signal came in, she sat up very straight. It was using the beacon frequency, prime sequences, clean, structured, unmistakably deliberate, and at the end of the mathematical string, something that had not been in the beacons, a new sequence shorter that the translation algorithms took 4 minutes to process. When the processing finished, the display showed a single rendered phrase. We hear you, we come in peace, we would like to talk. Brinso stared at it. Then she pressed the emergency line to Grand Arbiter Vreth's personal comm. The Accord Council met again within the hour. The emergency session that had been called to discuss the Dominion had technically never closed. Counselors had simply dispersed to eat and sleep and return. Vreth had not slept. He was too old for panic, but had been doing something adjacent to it for the past cycle, which was exhausting in its own dignified way. He read the translated signal, then he read it again. We come in peace, said Counselor Vess of the Shan Ma, with the tone of someone tasting something unfamiliar. That is the phrase. That is the phrase, said Vreth. It is a very simple phrase. It is. It could mean anything. It could, Vreth agreed. He had over 240 long cycles, developed the ability to agree with people in a way that gently communicated that he found their point obvious. He deployed it now. Vess went quiet. Counselor Pre of the Tharak had shifted to a muted yellow, cautious thinking in their species language. We have 3 options, they said through the flat voice of the translator. We ignore the signal and hope that vessel turns back. We send a warning and establish a boundary, or we respond. They are already inside the monitored zone, said Vreth. Ignoring them is the same as responding slowly. And their vessel, he paused in the particular way that on a Valkyrie elder meant the next words were going to be uncomfortable. Their vessel will not stop because we hope. It is not the kind of vessel that stops. That settled on the room. Nobody argued with it because everyone had looked at the sensor data, and all of them, regardless of species, had the same response to 3 km of weapons-capable spacecraft moving through their space with the unhurried certainty of something that does not worry much about what is in front of it. We respond, said Vreth. We open a communication channel. We speak to them. He looked around at the council. 11 species, some of whom had been part of the Accord for centuries, and some of whom were still learning what membership meant. We have been watching this species for 22 long cycles. We have not reached a conclusion. Perhaps it is time to let them speak for themselves. Another silence. Then one by one they agreed. The comm alert came through to the Dominion's bridge at 3:40 ship time. Vasquez was asleep. She was back in her command chair within 4 minutes, hair not entirely pinned, jacket sealed crooked at the collar. Harlow had the good sense to not mention either of these things. Asai was already at his station, the source signal isolated and analyzed. It's a hail, he said, tight beam directed at us, structured comm signal. They're trying to open a live channel. He looked at his captain. His voice had gone very careful. They are responding to us, ma'am. The bridge was quiet. Vasquez straightened her jacket. She ran one hand over her hair. She looked at the forward viewport for a moment. Those stars she had no names for, arranged in patterns she hadn't traced into shapes yet, and she took a breath that was slow enough to be deliberate and quiet enough to be almost private. Asai, accept the channel, full visual, full audio. Get Dr. Maida up here. Dr. Maida was the Dominion's xenolinguistic specialist, a small, intense woman who had spent 15 years preparing for a moment that everyone had told her might never come. Tell her she has 6 minutes. Dr. Maida arrived in 5. The channel opened. The faces that appeared on the Dominion's main comm display were not human. This was not a surprise, but it was still something that took a particular kind of mental adjustment. The way cold water is still a shock even when you know it's coming. There were 3 of them visible in the frame. One was tall and thin, pale-skinned, with 3 luminescent stalks rising from its head that glowed a steady, guarded blue. One was shorter, almost geometric in its sharpness, built in angles that seemed to have too many joints. One was not entirely visible, a shape at the edge of the frame, darker color, shifting across its skin surface in patterns the human eye wanted to read as emotion. They looked at the humans on the screen. The humans looked back. This was, for both sides, a moment that every intelligence briefing and xenobiology textbook and late-night philosophical conversation had described, but that no description had adequately prepared anyone for the actual fact of an alien face, the actual irreducible reality of eyes, or the equivalent of eyes that had not evolved under the same sun looking at you. Dr. Maida's translation array was running. The mathematical bridge they had built from the beacon signals gave it something to work from. It would not be perfect. It was a start. Vreth spoke first. The translation rendered it as, we are the Valkyrie Accord. You are in monitored space. Identify your vessel and your purpose. Vasquez answered without pause. ISV Dominion, Earth Collective Sol. System. My name is Captain Eliana. Vasquez, our purpose is exploration and first contact. She paused for exactly one beat. We found your beacons. We thought we should knock before walking in. Dr. Maida relayed this. The translation was imperfect. The concept of knocking required a three-part structural analogy to something that approximated a request for permission, but it landed. Vreth's stalks moved on the alien side of the channel in the Accord Council chamber. What was happening in the room behind Vreth was this. Every species present was watching the human captain with an intensity that burned. They were looking for aggression. They were looking for threat. Display, the expansion of physical space, the deliberate demonstration of size and capability, the territorial signals that every advanced species had in its early contact lexicon. They had read the file on humanity. They knew what the file said. What they saw was a woman in a slightly crooked jacket who looked like she had been woken up 40 minutes ago, holding a coffee cup, speaking to them the way you speak to a neighbor you have not met yet but are reasonably sure you're going to get along with. You entered a Accord-monitored space without permission, Vreth said. We didn't know it was Accord-monitored space, Vasquez replied. We found the beacons and followed them, which I understand may have been presumptuous. If we have violated a boundary, I apologize. We can hold position while we work out the protocol, she set her coffee down. We've been traveling for 14 months. We'd like very much to talk, if that's acceptable to you. Vreth looked at her. She looked back. His stalk shifted, the Valkyrie equivalent of a slow blink on the other end of the channel. Vasquez could not have known what that meant, but it meant something in the range of, I have spent a very long time preparing for this conversation, and you are not what I prepared for. You are aware, Vreth said carefully, of the scale of your vessel. You understand what it communicates. We understand that it's large, Vasquez said. It needs to be for the distance. We're a long way from home. She tilted her head slightly. Does it concern you a beat? The question was genuine. That was the thing that Counselor Pry, watching from the edge of frame, would later describe as the most disorienting part of the first contact exchange. It was not a diplomatic performance of concern. It was a real question. The human captain actually wanted to know. Yes, said Vreth, it concerns us. Then I'll be honest with you, Vasquez said. The ship is armed. I won't pretend otherwise. You have sensors and I assume you've used them, but we are Not here to threaten anyone, we are here. Because your beacons pointed the way. And because our species has been looking at the stars for a long time, and we would like very much to know who else is. Out here she paused, that is the whole of it. The whole of it. Vreth sat with that phrase for a moment. His translation array rendered it. Plainly, he turned it over. In his 240 long cycles of diplomacy, he had heard a great many opening statements from a great many civilizations seeking contact with the Accord. Some had been formal to the point of ceremony, some had been guarded, layered in legal language and technical qualifiers. One species had delivered their opening statement as a 17-part harmonic sequence. That took 3 days to translate and turned out to mean, roughly, please do not shoot us. None of them had said, that is the whole of it. There was something about the directness that was more unsettling than a threat. Would have been a threat he knew how to handle. This plain, tired, genuine thing had no category. I need to consult with my counsel, he said. Of course, said Vasquez, we'll be right here. She nodded professionally like she was confirming a meeting time with a colleague. The channel closed. In the Accord chamber, nobody spoke for a long moment, the color shifting. Counselor Pre had gone a deep, uncertain orange that the translator would have rendered as something close to bewildered. She said they would be right here, said Vass of the Shan Ma. Yes, said Vreth, meaning they are not leaving. Their weapons were not activated during the exchange. Vreth had been watching the sensor data. The entire time, weapons platforms cold. No targeting array engagement. They did not power up a single system during the communication. A species performing a threat display would have done at least one of those things. He was quiet for a moment. They genuinely came to talk. Another silence, a different kind from the ones before, less fear in it. Something more complicated. The file said Pre, whose orange was slowly shifting towards something greener. Careful interest, 4,000 pages. Yes. And she said, that is the whole of it. Yes, said Vreth. Pre's color shifted again. It was the Thurek equivalent of a long, slow exhale. I have been on this council for 60 long cycles, they said, through the flat translator that gave no color to the words. In 60 long cycles I have seen 11 civilizations make first contact. Most of them were afraid. Most of them were performing confidence to cover the fear. A pause. That woman was not afraid. No, agreed Vreth. That may be the most frightening thing I have ever encountered. Vreth sat with his ancient hands folded on his ancient desk and looked at the dark display that still held the ghost of the human captain's face, slightly crooked jacket, coffee cup, 14 months from home and not afraid. He thought about the file. He thought about the wars that became trade agreements, species that destroyed and rebuilt and kept going, the 4,000 pages with no conclusion. He thought about the ship, 3 kilometers of humanity's best work, holding position in monitored space, waiting politely. We need to invite them, he said. The council stirred. Grand Arbiter. If we do not invite them, Vreth said, they will sit in the hallway until we do. That ship is not going home. He looked around at 11 species, all of them older than humanity by centuries, all of them watching him with every equivalent of wide eyes they possessed. Better to Have them inside the room where we can. See them, he paused, and where they can. See us. He opened the channel again. The human captain answered on the first signal. She was still in the same chair. She had refilled her coffee. Captain Vasquez, Vreth said, the Valkyrian Accord would like to formally invite the ISV Dominion to our central station for introductory proceedings. He kept his voice level, careful. 240 long cycles of diplomacy deployed. Full, we believe it is time. Vasquez looked at him. Her expression was calm. Then she smiled. It was not a large smile, not triumphant, not the smile of someone who had won something. It was quieter than that, the smile of someone who has been traveling a very long time and has just seen for the first time the light of where they're going. We'll set course immediately, she said. Thank you. Vreth closed the channel. He sat for a moment. She smiled, said Ves. Yes, said Vreth. What does it mean, the baring of the teeth like that? The file says it is sometimes a threat display and sometimes it was not a threat display, said Vreth. He was quiet for a moment. I think it means she is happy, he said, as if he was still deciding whether that was better or worse than the alternative. He looked at the blank display for one more second. Then he began preparing, with the full weight of his centuries, for what came next. The file on humanity was 4,012 pages long. Grand Arbiter of Wrath had read all of it twice. He had read most of it a third time in the hours after closing the comm channel, with Captain Vasquez sitting alone in his private office with a cooling cup of amber root tea and the particular stillness of someone trying very hard to organize information that did not want to be organized. He called a full council reading session for the following morning. Not every council member had reviewed the complete file. The Accord had 11 member species, and each of them had their own analysts and their own summaries, and the general approach to species catalog entry 7441C had been, among most of the council, something in the range of someone else's handling it. The humans are far away. The committee will reach a conclusion. Eventually, we have other things. Now the humans were 17 short cycles away and closing, and everyone read the file. The session lasted most of the day. Councillor Vess of the Shan Ma made it to page 40 before needing to stop. Page 40 was the section on early human warfare, specifically the subsection on a historical conflict the humans call the Second World War, which had been, in terms of scale and casualties and industrial mobilization, something that Accord's analysts had flagged as remarkable primarily because humanity had started it, survived it, and then, within 2 generations, rebuilt the destroyed nations, formed lasting economic alliances with former enemies, and founded a global cooperative body dedicated to preventing it from happening again. Vess read that last part several times. They made it worse, they said to nobody in particular, then they fixed it, then they made it better than it was before. Nobody responded, everyone was reading. Councillor Reth of the Andat, a species that communicated through low frequency vibration and whose translated voice always sounded like the memory of thunder, had reached the medical section. The Andat were fragile by most standards. Their bodies operated with narrow tolerances of temperature and pressure, and an injury beyond a certain threshold was nearly always fatal. They had, as a result of this fragility, developed some of the most sophisticated, non-invasive medical technology in the Accord. Reth read about human surgery. The Andet did not have a gesture for disbelief. They had never needed one. Reth invented one now, a low hum that their translator rendered imperfectly. As this cannot be correct, the humans cut themselves open. Deliberately, they opened their own bodies, replaced parts that had failed with parts that had not closed themselves back up, and then survived, frequently with a success rate that had improved over centuries to something the file described as routine. They had a word for the people who performed this procedure, the word translated as physician, which the Accord used for healers, but the specific subcategory translated as surgeon, and the file noted that surgeons trained for over a decade, worked in shifts of sometimes 18 hours, and were considered within human culture to be among the most respected members of their society. Reth put the file down, picked it up again. Read the pain tolerance subsection. Put the file down again. Vreth, watching from the head of the table, said nothing. He had already gone through this. He remembered where he had been when he had first read each section, the moment his understanding of the species had been quietly, thoroughly revised, the warfare, the medicine, the history of disease plagues that had killed hundreds of millions of them, that they had survived and then built defenses against and continued. The climate subsection, which described 2 centuries of damage to their home planet, followed by a mobilization effort that had within 3 generations substantially reversed it, not entirely, partially, but the effort was ongoing, and the direction was correct, which was more than most species had managed. Then there was Section 31. Section 31 was titled, in the analyst's careful phrasing, recreation, activities, and voluntary physical risk-taking. Counselor Pre of the Tharak reached Section 31 approximately an hour into the session. Their color shifted from careful reading green to something that had no standard name in the Tharak spectrum, a pale, almost white shade that Vreth had only seen once before when a young Tharak counselor had witnessed a zero-gravity collision during an orbital inspection and gone into momentary shock. They said, Pre slowly, do this for fun. Yes, said Vreth. They fall from high places attached to thin cords. Yes. They ride down frozen mountains on flat pieces of material at high speed with no protective shell. That is correct. They enter a confined space with other members of their species and engage in structured physical combat. For sport, yes, and millions of other humans watch. Sometimes they eat a food item called a hot dog while watching. Bree's color went fully white. The hot dog, Vreth said, with the ghost of something that was not quite. Humor is not the alarming part. On the ISV Dominion, Captain Vasquez called an all-crew address at 800. Not the full assembly, the ship was too large for that. 412 people spread across 17 decks. She used the ship-wide comm, which meant her voice came out of every speaker on every level simultaneously, from the engine rooms to the med bay, to the small observation lounge on deck 4, where 3 junior technicians were eating breakfast and had been in the middle of an argument about whether or not synthetic eggs counted as real eggs. They stopped arguing. This is the captain, Vasquez said. By now, most of you know what's happened. For anyone who hasn't been briefed, we have made contact. The species are called the Valkyrie Accord. They represent 11 member civilizations. They have invited us to their central station. For formal introduction proceedings, we have accepted. We are on course. We will arrive in approximately 15 short cycles, about 17 of our days. She paused. I'm going to tell you what I know. Accord is old, much older than us. They have been watching us for a long time. Before this, we don't know everything they've observed, but we should assume it's substantial. They found us surprising enough to be cautious. We should respect that. Another pause. Shorter this time. We are going to be polite. We are going to be honest. We are not going to pretend to be smaller or less capable than we are, because they have sensors and they know what this ship is. But we're also not going to posture. We came out here to make contact, and we're going to do that the right way. Someone on deck 7, a young weapons tech named Bowen, who had in 14 months never once spoken on an open channel, opened the ship-wide comm by mistake instead of the deck local line and said, "Are we allowed to take pictures?" A half-second of silence. "Yes," said Vasquez, "you can take pictures. You cannot touch anything without asking first. You cannot eat anything offered to you without running it through the med scanner first. You will wear your dress uniform to any formal proceedings. If you are in an informal context." She stopped, reconsidered. "Actually, let's say dress uniform for everything until I say otherwise. And if someone from another species speaks to you and you don't understand what they're saying, you say so clearly and wait for the translator to catch up. You do not guess, you do not nod politely and hope it was not a question." She took one more breath. "This is the most important thing humanity has ever done. I need you to be exactly who you are. Don't perform. Don't posture. Just be the people who flew 14 months from home because they wanted to know what was out there. A beat. That's who we are. That's enough." She closed the channel. Chief Engineer Singh, who had been listening from the engine monitoring room on deck 12 with a wrench in one hand and a secondary coolant diagnostic on her screen, looked at the speaker above her workstation for a moment after the channel closed. She said, and went back to her diagnostic. 17 days is a long time when you know what is waiting at the end of them. The crew of the Dominion handled it the way crews handle long waits, which is to say some of them handled it well and some of them did not, and the ones who did not were mostly the ones who thought too much about what they couldn't control. There was more noise in the mess hall than usual, more games in the rec room. Dr. Maida Bale slept. She was running language reconstruction models 18 hours a day, building a more complete translation framework from the Accords, communication signals, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone doing the most important work of their life at the exact pace the work required and not one fraction faster. Vasquez ran the ship. She did briefings. She reviewed the xenobiology files that existed, thin, incomplete, built from long-range probe data and the short communication exchange. She read everything the Earth Collective had sent with them about first contact protocol, which turned out to be 80 pages of careful, earnest theory built by people who had never done it, full of useful principles and absolutely no preparation for the specific reality of being asked to dock a 3 km warship at a station run by 11 alien species. She ran the weapon systems in stand-down mode. She did this not because she expected to need them, but because the Accord had sensors and she wanted them to see it clearly. Everything cold, everything quiet. We are not pointing at you. On day 11, Ase picked up the first visual of the Accord station on long-range optical sensors. He sent the image to Vasquez's personal display without comment. She looked at it. The station was large, not Dominion. Large. Nothing out here apparently was built at the scale humanity built things. When it was nervous, but large enough. It was not the cold geometry of a human station. It did not look engineered the way human structures looked engineered. It grew was the best word for it. Curved and layered and complex, with sections that seemed to have been added over centuries by different hands with different aesthetics, so that the whole thing had the look of a city that had stopped planning itself at some point and simply continued. Lights moved along its surface in patterns that might have been functional or might have been beautiful, possibly both. Vasquez looked at it for a long time. Then she sent a message to the council channel. ISV Dominion confirms visual. We look forward to arrival, Captain Vasquez. In the council chamber, Vreth received the message and shared it with the room. The session had ended. Most counselors had retired. Vreth had stayed, as he often did, in the quiet of the chamber after the others had gone. Outside the chamber's viewport, the station moved in its slow orbit. The accumulated centuries of it, all those layers, all those additions, all the civilizations that had joined and sent their architects and their ideas and their materials until the thing had become something none of them had planned and all of them owned. He thought about the human captain's face, the slightly crooked jacket, the coffee. He thought about Section 30, one of the file, the thin cords, the frozen mountains, the hot dogs. He thought about the ship. There was a species in the Accord, the Tharak, who showed their emotions in color, that had a concept with no direct translation. The closest the Accord's language matrix could render it was something like the feeling of approaching something you cannot go back from, not fear, not excitement. The Tharak used it specifically for threshold moments, the instance before a door opens, before life changes, before the world is different from how it was. Vreth was not Thurek. He did not have the biology for color shifting or the vocabulary for that exact feeling. But sitting in the quiet of the council chamber with the station turning slowly outside the viewport and the human captain's message open on his display, he thought he understood it. 17 days ago, there had been no humans in this part of the galaxy. Now there were 412 of them in a ship the size of a small city flying toward his station at a polite and unhurried speed, taking pictures, wearing dress uniforms, arguing according to the background audio the comm technicians had accidentally captured during one open channel about whether synthetic eggs were real eggs. The galaxy had held its breath for 22 long cycles, watching the species from a careful distance, trying to decide what they were. Now the distance was going to be gone. Vreth looked at the message one more time. We look forward to arrival. He had no doubt that they did. That was, he reflected, perhaps the purest summary of everything in the file that he could think of. 4,000 pages, and that was the center of it. They looked forward. They We're always looking forward. He closed the display, stood his ancient body up from his ancient chair, and began walking toward his quarters to rest. There was a great deal to prepare. The humans were coming, and the one thing Vreth had learned in 240 long cycles of watching and reading, and now finally speaking to them, was this: whatever he prepared, it would probably not be enough. Not because they were dangerous, because they were relentless. And the difference he was beginning to understand mattered enormously. The Dominion could not fit in the docking bay. This was not a surprise to anyone on the Accord station, because the Accord station's largest docking bay had been built to accommodate the biggest vessels in the Accord fleet, and the biggest vessel in the Accord fleet was a Thurak cargo hauler that ran at 400 m. Nobody had ever needed a bay for something 3 km long. The concept had simply not come up. So the Dominion parked. It did this the way a very large person sits down in a chair that is too small. Not gracefully, but with total commitment and zero apology. It came to a full stop approximately 2 km off the station's outer ring, locked its position with attitude thrusters, powered down its main engines to standby, and then opened a comm channel to inform the station that it was ready whenever they were. The station's docking coordinator, a young Velkari named Savin, whose job had never before required creative thinking, stared at his display for 30 full seconds before issuing the first shuttle approach instructions of what was going to be. He already sensed a long and unusual career. 2 human shuttles departed the Dominion at 900 station time. They were not large by shuttle standards. They were actually quite ordinary, functional, gray-white, built for transit rather than impression, each one carrying 20 people in dress uniforms, and one very awake xenolinguistics specialist who had not slept properly in 11 days and was running on purpose and stimulant patches in the pure adrenaline of being, professionally speaking, exactly where she had always wanted to be. Vreth watched the shuttles approach on the docking visual feed from the council observation deck. Behind him, at a careful distance, stood 6 other counselors and 14 members of various station security and diplomatic staff, all of them arranged with the studied casualness of people pretending they had simply happened to be in this particular room at this particular moment, and were not, in fact, watching with every sensory organ they possessed. The shuttles docked. The airlock cycled. The first human through the door was not Captain Vasquez. It was Bowen, the young weapons tech from Deck 7, who had accidentally opened the shipwide channel to ask about pictures. He was 24 years old, from a coastal city in what had once been called Brazil, and he was first through the airlock because he was assigned to the forward security detail, and his job was to step into unknown spaces before the captain did. He had been doing that job for 8 months and had never had cause to think much about it. He stepped through the airlock into the Accord station's reception corridor and stopped. The corridor was enormous and strange, and lit with a quality of light that had no earth reference, not warm, not cold. Something else entirely, a color the eye kept trying to name and couldn't. The walls curved in ways that felt grown rather than built. The air smelled of something faintly sweet and faintly mineral, like rain on hot stone, but from a planet that had never had earth, stone, or earth's rain. Standing at the far end of the corridor was a reception line of alien beings. Bowen looked at them. They looked at him. He turned back to the airlock and said, in the tone of someone reporting, routine status. Clear, Captain, it's something. Vasquez came through. Vreth had reviewed in preparation for this moment all available documentation on human physical presentation and social behavior. He knew the approximate height range. He knew about bilateral symmetry, forward-facing eyes, the exposed skin, the hair. He had seen Vasquez on the comm screen. He was prepared. He was not, it turned out, prepared for 40 of them at once. They came through the airlock in groups, assembling in the corridor with the quiet efficiency of people who had practiced this, and he knew from the file they had practiced this. Vasquez had run the entry sequence 6 times in the 17 days of approach. They were wearing their formal uniforms, dark with colored trim, and they stood with the upright posture of people who were aware they were being looked at and had decided to be comfortable with it. They were so varied. The file had mentioned this genetic diversity high, result of a single species history of geographic separation, but the fact of it standing in front of him was something different. Tall and short, many different colors of skin, different shapes of face, all of them the same species clearly, and all of them different in ways that no other species in the Accord was different from itself. He found it remarkable. He found it, if he was being precise with himself, beautiful. Then Vasquez came through and saw him, and walked directly toward him with her hand extended. Vreth had read about the handshake, physical greeting, the clasping of the right manipulator, the brief up and down motion that signified trust and equal standing. He had practiced it carefully and privately with a simulation model. He took her hand. She shook it firm, warm, brief. Grand Arbiter of Wrath, she said, it is an honor. Captain Vasquez, he said, welcome to the Accord. And that was the moment, not the ship, not the comm exchange, not the file or the beacons or any of the 17 days of preparation. That was the moment, two beings from 2 different stars clasping hands in a corridor that smelled of alien rain, and meaning it, both of them meaning it. His translation array caught it, her words, her body language, the steadiness of her eyes. She was not performing honor, she felt it. He felt something in return that his language had a word for. He did not say the word, he was a diplomat, but he felt it. The formal proceedings were held in the Accord's main reception hall, which was the largest interior space on the station and had been the site of every new member introduction in the Accord's 3-century history. The ceiling was high enough to echo. The walls were inlaid with the sigils of all 11 member species, carved in the materials of their home worlds. Vasquez stood at the center of it with 10 of her senior staff and looked up at the ceiling the way humans look at things that are very old and very large, which is to say, with an upward tilt of the head and a brief, unguarded expression that was not all exactly, but was the thing that comes just before. Chief Engineer Singh looked at the wall carvings for a long moment, then she pulled out a small device from her jacket pocket and began, very quietly, taking extremely detailed photographs of the construction techniques visible in the inlay work. This was not on the approved list of activities for the formal session. It was also technically not on the disapproved list Vasquez saw her doing, and decided that the inlay work was probably not classified. Dr. Maida stood next to Vreth's translation specialist, a young Valkyrie named Estelle, who had been preparing for this assignment for 3 long cycles, and looked in the way that all linguists look when confronted with a real live working translation challenge, like someone trying to solve a beautiful and impossible puzzle while also having the best day of their life. They spoke to each other in the careful, delighted shorthand of people who share a professional obsession. "Your click stops," Maida said, gesturing at a section of the Valkyrie phoneme chart on her pad. "Are they positional or tonal? Because the sensor analysis suggested positional, but the stress patterns imply positional," said Estelle with something the translation array rendered as intensity, but the pitch of the preceding syllable changes the spatial meaning. "It is very precise." "Fascinating," Maida was already writing. "We have something similar in some of our tonal languages, Mandarin, Vietnamese. The tone changes the meaning of the same phoneme entirely. What is the maximum number of spatial positions a single click stop can?" They were lost to the conversation. Within 4 minutes, neither of them fully participated in the formal proceedings. Nobody stopped them. Counselor Pre of the Therac, watching from their designated position in the reception line, had shifted to a deep amber that indicated something between admiration and discomfort. They were watching the humans move through the hall, not patrolling, not threatening, simply existing in the space with the ease of people who felt improbably and immediately at home. One of the younger officers had already made eye contact with a Thurek junior diplomat and smiled the bare teeth expression, and the junior diplomat had gone through 7 colors in 2 seconds before someone senior whispered a rapid explanation, and the junior diplomat exhaled a long breath and slowly, experimentally, tried to smile back. Their facial musculature was not built for it. The result was unusual. The young officer gave them a thumbs up. The junior diplomat looked at the thumb, looked at the face, looked back at the thumb. Pre's amber deepened. They filed that away. The formal address lasted 1 hour. Vreth spoke for the Accord history, principles, membership, the structure of the 11 species body. Vasquez spoke for humanity, origin, intent, the long reach from a single blue planet to this corridor, this room, this moment. Her speech was not long. She had written it in 20 minutes and revised it twice, and it was not the speech of a politician or a poet. It was the speech of a person telling the truth in plain language, which is rarer and harder than it sounds. When she finished, the hall was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something has landed that everyone present will remember. Vreth responded formally. The Accord would consider the request for contact. Proceedings, temporary diplomatic status, would be extended. A working group would be formed. Then the formal session ended and the informal one began, which is to say, someone brought food. The food was necessarily alien. The Accord's kitchen staff had spent considerable time on the question of what to serve beings whose biology they had only theoretical knowledge of. They had produced a range of items that were, based on the file's nutritional data, theoretically safe for human consumption, pending medical clearance. The items were arranged on long flat surfaces in the reception hall and were not by any honest standard recognizable as food to the human attendees. They were shapes and colors that had no Earth reference. Some of them moved slightly, which was a property of their natural state and not an indication of anything alarming, though the first human to notice this took a careful step backward before Maida, who had read the food briefing, murmured a rapid explanation. Vasquez looked at the spread. She looked at the Accord senior kitchen representative, who was a small and anxious Velkari who had clearly put significant effort into this and was now waiting with the exposed hope of someone who has cooked for strangers and needs to know if it was good. Vasquez picked up a small, smooth, pale item from the nearest tray. She held it up in a way that was a question. Is this how you eat this? The kitchen representative made an affirmative gesture. She put it in her mouth. She chewed. She thought about it. She nodded in a way that clearly meant, this is good. The kitchen representative's stalks went a warm pink. Vasquez turned to Singh and said quietly, taste a bit like a mushroom that went to university. Singh put one in her mouth, considered. Star anise, she said with something under it, nutty. They both had another one. The kitchen representative watched this. Their stalks went pinker. Across the room, Bowen had found himself standing near a pair of Ondi diplomats who communicated through vibration and whose translated voices sounded like distant thunder. They were very tall. They were looking at him with the careful attention of species who had read a file about him and were now recalibrating against the reality. He was not by his own species standards large. He was average, but he was standing in dress uniform with the quiet alertness of someone who had done 14 months on a deep space warship and was fully comfortable in uncomfortable situations, which reads across almost any species barrier as a kind of steadiness. One of the Andi said something. The translator rendered it as, you are young. I'm 24, Bowen said. A pause. The translator worked. Your species sends the young on the first ship. Bowen considered this. We send everyone on the first ship, he said. We didn't want to leave anyone out. The Andi were still for a moment. Then something moved in their frequency below hearing range, felt in the chest, that the translator did not catch, but that Vreth, watching from across the room, recognized from his years on the council. It was the Andi sound for, I see. The reception lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Vreth walked with Vasquez to the shuttle dock, just the two of them and their respective translators, moving through a corridor that was quieter now, the station settling into its night cycle, the light going softer and slightly bluer. Your crew, said Vreth. Yes. They are not afraid. Vasquez walked for a moment without answering. It was not a defensive pause. It was the pause of someone being precise. Some of them are. Bowen was terrified for the first hour and handled it by being completely normal, which is its own kind of courage. She looked at the corridor ahead of them. Fear isn't the problem. Fear is information. What you do with it is the character. Vreth processed this. The file, he said, described your species in many ways. It used many categories. What category were we missing? He thought about the kitchen representatives' pink stalks, Meta and Ostel still talking somewhere in the station, long past the end of the formal session. The junior diplomats, uncertain, trying smile. Bowen and the Andi, Singh and her photographs of the Inlay work and her nutty mushroom. Analysis. We kept trying to decide, he said, whether you were dangerous. And I think that was the wrong question. He paused. They had reached the shuttle. Doc, the right question was whether you were good. Vasquez looked at him. Are we? She asked, plain real. Vreth met her eyes, the forward-facing eyes evolved for hunting, full of something his species had a word for, and hers did, and he said, I believe so. I believe that is the conclusion the committee could not reach, because they were looking for danger and missed what was underneath it. She was quiet for a moment. We're trying, she said. Yes, said Vreth, I know. He watched the shuttle carry her back to the ship that should not have fit here, and didn't and had come anyway. He stood at the dock viewport until the shuttle's running lights were small enough to be stars. Behind him in the station, an alert was waiting on his secure terminal. He didn't know that yet. He stood and watched the lights and felt for a short and quiet moment something close to peace. Then he went inside, and the alert was there. And the peace was over, the alert on. Vreth's terminal was flagged in the highest priority color the Accord system used. That color had a name. Most of the station staff had worked their entire careers without seeing it. Vreth read the alert once, then he stood very still for a moment in the way that very old beings sometimes stand still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a mind moving very fast inside a body that has learned not to show it. Then he opened the council emergency channel and he said the word that brought every counselor to their screen within 2 minutes, regardless of what they had been doing. VREN. The VREN were not members of the Accord. They had never wanted to be. Membership implied equality, and the VREN had a very fixed idea about what they were equal to, which was nothing. They were a raiding species, old, organized, and patient in the specific way that predators are patient, and they had been operating in this region of space for longer than most of the Accord's member civilizations had held. Space flight they did not destroy. Stations, destruction was wasteful. What they did was arrive with enough ships to make the math obvious, state a price for their departure, and wait. The Accord paid. It had been paying for decades. The official language for this was non-conflict resource transfer under duress, which was a 12-syllable way to say we give them things so they leave. The unofficial language was shorter and more accurate and not used in formal session. The VREN had a fleet of 42 vessels. Not large by warship standards, each one was roughly 150 m, fast and angular and built for intimidation more than firepower. They didn't need firepower, they needed the threat of it, and the Accord's response to that threat had always been reliable. They had dropped out of faster-than-light transit 40 minutes ago. At the edge of the station's sensor range, they were moving in. Vreth explained this to Vasquez on a private channel in the flat, careful tone of a being who has carried a shameful truth for a long time and is now setting it down in front of someone whose opinion has begun unexpectedly to matter. She listened without interrupting. That was the first thing he noticed. She did not make sounds of outrage or ask questions before he was finished. She listened to the whole of it. How long? She said when he was done. 41 long cycles. A pause. 41 years. By your measurement, approximately. Yes. Another pause, shorter this time. And your fleet. Our nearest combat-capable vessels are 11 short cycles away. We have station defense systems, but they are not they. We're not built to the math against 42 vessels. Does not. He stopped. He was not, he realized, accustomed to this particular shame. He was accustomed to managing it, which was different. Accord was built for diplomacy, he said. Quietly, not war. I know, said Vasquez. Her voice was not unkind. That was the second thing he noticed. He looked at his display, the Viren. Fleet's approach vector, 42 ships moving in steady formation. He looked at the secondary display, the ISV Dominion, sitting 2 km off the station's outer ring, running lights on, weapons cold. Waiting. Captain, he said, I want to be clear that I am not asking. Grand Arbiter, she said. He stopped. How many people live on this station? He told her. 14,000 across all species, staff and families, and the permanent diplomatic community that had grown up around the Accord over 3 centuries. Silence. Then I'm going to make a call. Stay on this channel. On the bridge of the Dominion, Vasquez's voice came through the command speakers at a volume that was level and precise, and left no room for ambiguity. Battle stations, weapons hot, all platforms a breath. We are not firing. First, we are positioning. Move the ship between the station and the incoming fleet now. The bridge became a machine. It did this without drama. There was no shouting. Harlow relayed to navigation. Asa ran the targeting arrays. Singh's voice came up from engineering, confirming power redistribution to the weapons grid and structural shielding, with the same tone she used to report coolant levels. The 4 ion pulse engines that had carried the Dominion 14 months from Earth burned blue-white, and the 3 km ship moved, not fast, not gracefully, but with that absolute mountainous inevitability that it had when it committed to a direction. It placed itself between the station and the Varen fleet. On the Varen lead ship, a commander named Hethar had been watching the human vessel since her fleet's arrival. She had been briefed on it. The Accords. Contact with a new species was not unknown to the Varen. They had sources, and the sources had reported the ship's arrival with the expected alarm. Hethar had processed the report and reached the conclusion that it was not relevant to current operations. Accord paid. That was what the Accord did. Whatever new pet they had found in the outer systems did not change the math. The math was 42 ships. She watched the Dominion move. She recalculated. On the Vreth's private channel, Vasquez's voice returned. I'm going to hail them, she said. Is there anything I should know about how they negotiate? Vreth thought about 41 long cycles of transfers and the withdrawals and the language of managed humiliation. They respond to clear force, he said. They do not respect requests. They do not accept partial measures. He paused. They have never encountered anything they could not outlast or outprice. Good, said Vasquez. That means they don't know what I'm about to say. She opened the channel to the Viren fleet. The translation of her words, rendered afterward by 3 independent linguistic analysts into the most precise equivalence available, was as follows. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the ISV Dominion Earth Collective. You are Approaching a station under my protection, I am asking you one time to stop where you are and turn back. I am not making a threat, I am describing what is going to happen if you continue. You have 60 seconds to decide. The fleet stopped. Not all of it, some of the outer ships slowed and held the lead formation. Continued, slower now but continued. Hethvar's response came back through the translator in the Viren idiom, flat. Practice the language of a species that had said this many times to many different beings. Withdraw your vessel. This is not your matter. What happens here has been settled for longer than your kind has held stars. 50 seconds, said Vasquez. Hethvar looked at the Dominion on her display, the size of it, the weapon. Signatures active now, every platform. Live, the targeting arrays painting the Viren fleet in frequencies that meant I see every one of you precisely, and I have already done the mathematics. Her second-in-command said, there. Weapon output. I see it, said Hethvar. Exceeds our entire fleets combined. I see it, she said again, louder. She looked at the display. She thought about the math. She thought about it for a long time. She gave the order to stop. The fleet held position, 42 ships. Sitting in the dark, not moving. 20 seconds, said Vasquez. In the Accord Council chamber, 14,000 people held their breath inside the station around them without knowing it. The counselors watched their displays in silence. Vreth stood at the main viewer. He watched the Dominion sitting between the station and the Viren fleet like a wall that had decided to be a wall, not asking, not threatening, simply existing at a scale that made asking unnecessary. He had read the file on humanity, all 4,000 pages. He had read about their wars and their medicine and their extreme sports and their hot dogs. He had spent 22 long cycles watching them from a distance, trying to build a category. He had one now. This was the category. A species that arrived at the edge of the unknown for 14 months without flinching. A species that walked into a room full of aliens in a slightly crooked jacket and said, that is the whole of it. Species that found alien food interesting and alien architecture worth photographing and alien linguists worth staying up all night talking to. And when something was wrong, they put themselves between it and the 14,000 people who lived inside the station without being asked, without negotiation, without calculating the price. The 60 seconds ended. Hethvar had not moved. Her fleet had not moved. She was still looking at the Dominion on her display, at the weapons platforms tracking her ships with the patient precision of things that had been built for exactly this purpose, and she was doing something she had not done in 40 years of Vrin operations. She was afraid. Not of dying. The Vrin were not afraid of dying in the standard way. She was afraid of something more specific. Fear of having misjudged something so fundamentally that your entire map of how the universe works turns out to be wrong. She had a map. It was a good map. It had worked for 40 years. The map said everyone pays. Eventually, the Dominion said something else. She opened the return channel. We are withdrawing, she said. The words tasted unfamiliar. This engagement is terminated. Thank you, said Vasquez. 2 words flat, not triumphant, not cruel, the thank you of someone who means it. Hethvar closed the channel. She sat for a long moment on her bridge, then she gave the course corrections, and the Vrin fleet turned, 42 ships in formation, and began moving away from the station. One ship in the back of the formation did not turn, it kept moving forward, picking up speed, a show of face-saving gesture, a junior commander making a point at the possible moment. The Dominion fired once. One shot, one of the mid-range rail platforms, calibrated not to destroy, but to disable. Engines gone, weapons gone, the ship sitting dead in space. Intact, crew alive, going nowhere. The rest of the Viren fleet did not stop, but they moved faster. Within 20 minutes they were gone. Vasquez stood down battle stations. She did not make a speech, she did not address the shipwide comm with words about victory or courage or humanity's finest hour. She said to the bridge crew, specifically, good work, resume standard operations. Then she sat down in her command chair, and Harlow brought her a cup of coffee. The synthetic kind, because the real reserves were gone, and she drank it and looked at the stars and was quiet for a while. She sent one message to Vireth's private channel. It's done, let me know if they need anything from us on the disabled ship. Rescue, medical repairs. We're here. Vireth read the message in the council chamber, where 11 species were still standing in the positions they had held during the engagement. Nobody had moved. Nobody had sat down. Everyone was still in the grip of the last 40 minutes. He read the message twice. Then he read it a third time, because the third time he needed to confirm that the species that had just done that positioned 3 km of weapons between a station and a fleet, and ended 41 long cycles of tribute in 60 seconds, was now asking if the people they had just stopped needed medical attention. He sat down. His legs had decided, quietly and without his permission, that he had been standing long enough. The full council session was called the following morning. It was not an emergency session. It was the other kind, deliberate, formal, the kind the Accord used for decisions that would be on record for centuries. Vreth stood at the head of the chamber. The counselors were in their seats. The sigils of 11 species were on the walls. He made the motion. Temporary observer status for the Earth. Collective first tier, the beginning of the formal contact process, the first step on a road that led at its far end to full membership. It was not a decision made out of gratitude. Vreth was careful about that. In his address to the council, gratitude was personal, and politics could not live on personal feeling alone. It was a decision made because the council had spent 22 long cycles trying to answer the wrong question, and now they had the right one, and the right one had an answer. Are they good? Yes. The vote was 11 for, 0 against. Vreth told Vasquez by comm she was in her command chair. She thanked him with the same plain steadiness she brought to everything, and he could see on the visual feed that she was going to hold it together for the duration of the call, and then possibly not, somewhere private later. He understood that. He had felt the same thing after a few votes in his life, the weight of something finally going right. There will be a long process ahead, he said, many sessions, much paperwork. He paused, the ghost of something not quite humor, the same thing he'd almost felt when explaining Section 31. The Accord is very good at paperwork. We'll manage, she said. I believe you will. He looked at her. On the display, the forward-facing eyes. the slight upward line at the corners of her mouth that he had learned in a short time to read. Captain, one more question, if I may. Go ahead. Why did you ask if they needed medical attention? The Viren after. She was quiet for a moment. Because they're alive, she said. They made a bad choice today and they know it. That's enough. We don't need to make it worse. He held that, set it next to everything else in the file, found it fit. The committee, he said, spent 22 long cycles and 4,000 pages trying to categorize your species. Did they figure it out? No, he said, but I think I have. She looked at him, waited. You are, he said, the only species I have encountered in 240 long cycles who would end a military engagement and immediately ask if the other side was all right. Vasquez looked at the stars outside her viewport for a moment. We've been the other side, she said. More than once. He nodded slowly. Yes, I know. He closed the channel. In the council chamber, in the quiet, after the vote, in the call, in the long wait of the morning, Vreth sat with his ancient hands folded on his ancient desk and looked at nothing in particular for a while. Outside the viewport, the Accord station turned in its slow orbit, the same station it had always been, all those layers, all those centuries, all those civilizations that had joined and added and built until the thing was more than any of them had planned. 2 km off the outer ring, the ISV Dominion sat in the dark, running lights on, engines at standby, going nowhere. It had come 14 months from a single blue planet at the edge of a quiet star system, and it had parked itself in a hallway that wasn't its hallway, and it had knocked and it had talked, and when something had come that needed stopping, it had stopped it and asked afterward if everyone was all right. Humanity had arrived. The galaxy exhaled, and in the mess hall of the Dominion on Deck 3, Captain Eliana Vasquez sat at the corner table with a cup of synthetic coffee and a bowl of instant noodles, and she slurped loudly and looked out the small circular porthole at the alien station turning in the dark. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been trying to reach for a very long time, that you have finally reached. That is exactly what you hoped it would be, and also nothing like what you imagined. She had a second bowl of noodles. Outside, the stars held still. The Dominion held still. The whole wide galaxy, for just that moment, held still.